In the previous lesson, we covered the ransomware business model and why this form of attack has become so profitable for criminals. Now let's work to understand what happens before the ransomware actually deploys. Ransomware attacks don't begin with encryption. They begin weeks or months earlier when attackers first compromise a network. This lesson covers how attackers gain that initial access and what they do during the extended period between compromise and encryption. Understanding this pre-encryption phase is important because it's when detection and prevention are still possible. Once encryption begins, it's too late. Modern ransomware attacks follow a predictable pattern with distinct phases. Initial compromise gives attackers a foothold in the network. Reconnaissance and lateral movement allows them to explore the environment and access critical systems. Privilege escalation grants them administrative control. Persistence mechanisms ensure continued access even if the initial entry point is closed. Data exfiltration occurs before encryption for double extortion. Finally, ransomware deployment encrypts systems simultaneously across the network. This entire process, from initial compromise to encryption, can take weeks or months. Attackers are patient because thorough preparation maximizes damage and likelihood of payment. Attackers use several common methods to gain initial network access. Phishing remains the most prevalent. A single employee clicking a malicious link or opening a compromised attachment provides the foothold attackers need. As we covered in the first section, these phishing emails are sophisticated and increasingly difficult to distinguish from legitimate communications. Exploiting unpatched vulnerabilities in internet-facing services is another common vector. VPN appliances, web applications, email servers, and remote desktop services all present potential entry points if not properly updated and secured. Brute forcing weak or default passwords on remote access services like RDP, SSH, or VPN connections. Attackers use credential stuffing with breach data or simply try common passwords until they find valid credentials. Purchasing access from initial access brokers who specialize in compromising networks and selling that access to ransomware affiliates. This outsourcing of the initial compromise phase has made ransomware more accessible to criminals without sophisticated technical skills. Compromising managed service providers who maintain remote access to multiple client networks. A single MSP compromise can provide access to dozens or hundreds of organizations simultaneously. Many ransomware attacks succeed because organizations fail to patch known vulnerabilities. Software vendors regularly release security updates addressing discovered vulnerabilities. When these updates are released, details about the vulnerability become public knowledge. Attackers immediately begin scanning the internet for systems that have not yet been patched. The window between patch release and widespread exploitation can be days or even hours. Organizations that delay patching create exploitable windows that attackers reliably find. The challenge is that patching requires testing, scheduling downtime, and coordination across IT teams. Security teams want immediate patching, but operations teams need to ensure patches don't break production systems. That tension often results in delays that attackers exploit. Remote access tools that enable legitimate work from home also create attack opportunities. RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol, is particularly targeted. Attackers scan the internet for exposed RDP services, then attempt to brute force credentials or exploit RDP vulnerabilities. Successful RDP compromise provides direct access to Windows systems inside networks. VPN services require proper configuration and multi-factor authentication. VPNs secured only with username and password are vulnerable to credential stuffing or brute force attacks. The massive shift to remote work during and after COVID-19 significantly expanded the attack surface. Organizations rapidly deployed remote access solutions without always implementing proper security controls, creating opportunities attackers quickly exploited. Valid credentials are the most valuable form of initial access because they allow attackers to authenticate legitimately. Credentials obtained through phishing, purchased from breached databases, or stolen through credential stuffing allow attackers to log in as authorized users, often bypassing security controls designed to detect unauthorized access, as the authentication is technically legitimate. Weak passwords on service accounts, administrative accounts, or user accounts provide entry points. Attackers specifically target privileged accounts that provide broader access once once compromised. Dwell time is the period between initial compromise and detection, and it's often measured in weeks or months. Industry studies consistently show that attackers maintain undetected access for 20 to 30 days on average, sometimes much longer. During this time, they're conducting reconnaissance, moving laterally, escalating privileges, and preparing for ransomware deployment. From the attacker's perspective, longer dwell time is better. It provides more time to thoroughly understand the environment, identify all critical systems, locate and compromise backups, and position themselves for maximum impact. From the defender's perspective, this extended dwell time represents missed opportunities for detection and remediation. The ransomware deployment that seems sudden and catastrophic was actually the culmination of weeks of undetected attacker activity. Once inside a network, attackers conduct systematic reconnaissance to understand the environment, mapping the network topology to understand how systems connect and what exists on the network. They identify domain controllers, file servers, databases, and other critical infrastructure. They locate backup systems that must be disabled or destroyed before encryption. They identify user accounts, especially privileged accounts that could provide elevated access. They search for sensitive data that can be exfiltrated for double extortion leverage. They observe security tools and monitoring systems to understand what capabilities defenders have. They identify network segmentation and how to bypass it. Initial compromise rarely provides access to all systems an attacker needs to reach. Lateral movement is the process of expanding access throughout the network. Attackers leverage legitimate administrative tools like PowerShell, WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation, and remote management utilities. They exploit trusted relationships between systems, using credentials from one compromised system to authenticate to others. They target domain controllers specifically because compromising Active Directory provides credentials and access to essentially all systems in a Windows environment. They hunt for cached credentials, password files, or configuration files containing credentials on systems they access. They move from lower privileged systems to higher privileged systems, from user workstations to servers, from segmented network zones to more sensitive areas. This lateral movement often happens over days or weeks as attackers systematically expand their foothold throughout the environment. Initial access might be through a standard user account with limited permissions. Attackers need administrative or system-level privileges to deploy ransomware and disable security tools. They exploit misconfigured permissions where users have more access than necessary. They leverage known vulnerabilities in operating systems that allow privilege escalation. They steal credentials from administrators when those administrators log into compromised systems. They search for service accounts that often have excessive privileges and weak password policies. They exploit improperly secured scripts or scheduled tasks running with elevated privileges. Achieving domain administrator or equivalent privileges is often a key milestone in the attack timeline. From that point, the attacker has near complete control over the environment. There's a relevant observation from the military strategist Karl von Clausewitz. In his work on war, he wrote, "The aggressor is always peace-loving. He would prefer to take over our country unopposed. To prevent this, we must be willing to make war." Clausewitz was describing the asymmetric nature of conflict. Attackers prefer victims to be passive, while defenders must be constantly vigilant. This applies perfectly to the ransomware initial access phase. Attackers would prefer to infiltrate networks completely unopposed, conducting reconnaissance, preparing their attack without interference. They benefit from every day that defenders don't detect their presence. Defenders must actively hunt for threats, even when there's no obvious incident. Passive defense, waiting for alerts from security tools, is insufficient because skilled attackers operate specifically to avoid triggering those alerts. The defender who waits for obvious signs of attack has already lost. The network was compromised weeks ago. The attacker has been preparing all this time. The ransom deployment is imminent. Attackers establish multiple persistence mechanisms to maintain access even if defenders discover and remediate their initial entry point. They create additional user accounts, often with names that blend in with legitimate accounts. They schedule tasks that reestablish access if connections are lost. They install backdoors on multiple systems throughout the network, so closing one access point doesn't eliminate their presence. They compromise multiple entry points, different VPN accounts, different vulnerable services, different systems with remote access capability. They install legitimate remote management tools that IT might not recognize as malicious. This redundancy means that detecting one indicator of compromise does not solve the problem. Organizations that find and remove one backdoor often miss others, allowing attackers to regain access after defenders believe they've removed the threat. Before deploying ransomware, attackers must disable or bypass security tools that would detect or prevent the attack. They terminate antivirus processes, stop endpoint detection and response tools, disable Windows Defender and built-in security features, and delete logs that would provide forensic evidence of their activity. They identify and disable backup agents and services to prevent recovery from backups. They locate centralized security monitoring tools and either disable them or execute ransomware executables from scanning. Some attackers exploit vulnerabilities in security tools themselves, using the tool's elevated privileges to disable protection. Others use legitimate administrative tools to stop security services in ways that might not immediately trigger alerts. Modern ransomware operations specifically target backup systems because they represent the primary recovery path. Attackers locate backup servers, delete backup files or corrupt backup data, disable backup schedules and services, and compromise credentials for backup administration. Some attacks encrypt backups along with production data. Others simply delete backups entirely. The goal is to eliminate recovery options that would allow the victim to restore operations without paying the ransom. Organizations that believe their backups protect them from ransomware often discover during an attack that their backups were compromised weeks earlier during the initial access and reconnaissance phase. As we've talked about, double extortion requires exfiltrating data before encryption, which happens during this pre-encryption phase. Attackers identify the most sensitive data, customer information, financial records, trade secrets, confidential communications, and embarrassing internal documents. They gradually copy this data to attacker-controlled servers over days or weeks. The exfiltration happens slowly to avoid triggering data loss prevention alerts or network anomaly detection. Small amounts of data leave the network regularly rather than massive transfers that would be obviously suspicious. By the time encryption occurs, the attacker already has everything they need for the data publication threat. The encryption is just one of multiple leverage points. Attackers choose when to deploy ransomware strategically to maximize impact and payment likelihood. They wait until they've thoroughly compromised the environment, have access to all critical systems, have disabled security tools and backups, and have exfiltrated desired data. They choose timing that maximizes disruption, weekends and holidays when IT staffing is reduced, end of fiscal periods when operations are critical, or during periods of high business activity. They deploy simultaneously across the network using automated deployment tools to encrypt as many systems as possible before defenders can respond. The goal is to create maximum disruption in minimum time, leaving the victim with no opportunity to contain the spread once it begins. And as we know, despite all the technical sophistication, initial access often comes down to human factors. One employee clicking one phishing link, one system admin using a weak password on a VPN account, one IT team delaying a critical security patch, or one managed service provider with insufficient security allowing compromise that spreads to clients. These human decisions and actions create the initial access opportunities that enable everything that follows. The technical sophistication of the subsequent attack does not change the fact that prevention often depends on basic security hygiene. Detection can be very difficult since attackers do specifically work hard to avoid detection during their pre-encryption phase. They use legitimate tools that are part of normal IT administration: PowerShell scripts, remote management utilities, administrative commands. They move slowly, avoiding the rapid automated activity that triggers anomaly detection. They'll often operate during business hours when network activity is highest and their actions blend in. They're studying what security tools are deployed and how they function, then operating within the gaps and blind spots of those tools. They clear logs and hide evidence of their activity. Security tools generate vast numbers of alerts, many of which are false positives. Defenders struggle to identify the meaningful signals indicating active compromise among the noise of routine alerts. Understanding that ransomware attacks involve extended pre-encryption phases should change defensive strategies. Focus on preventing that initial access through robust phishing defenses, aggressive patching, secure remote access configurations, and credential security. Assume that prevention will eventually fail and invest in detection capabilities that can identify attacker activity during the dwell time before encryption. Implement network segmentation that limits lateral movement, monitor for reconnaissance activities and privilege escalation attempts, protect backup systems with the same rigor as production systems. Practice incident response before it's needed. When ransomware deploys, you won't have time to figure out procedures. You need rehearsed response capabilities. The period between initial compromise and ransomware deployment is a critical window for defenders. If attackers are detected during reconnaissance or lateral movement, ransomware can be prevented. The attack can be contained, the attackers removed, and systems secured before encryption occurs. But this requires active threat hunting, not just reactive response to alerts. It requires understanding normal network behavior well enough to recognize abnormal attacker activity. It requires taking initial indicators seriously and investigating thoroughly rather than dismissing weak signals. Organizations that successfully prevent ransomware increasingly do so by detecting attackers during this pre-encryption phase, not by preventing initial access entirely. Now that we've covered how attackers gain access and prepare networks for ransomware, our next lesson will cover data exfiltration and double extortion tactics more in depth.